Hey guys, Ridgeway here with our next lesson. This one we're going to be doing in class, but I'm going to also record it for you here so that you have this if you need, if need be. So we're going to be doing the American Revolution in basically a couple of recordings, and let's dive right into it. So you're going to click the pair to get to the warm-up. Once you are there, you're just going to head to slide number 2 and just a quick check from something that we did in the previous classes. So, I've given you an example here of like how I did it, is write down everything you know about the American Revolution in 2 minutes. So we'll see how you do on that, and then we can go forward from there. So I kind of have spoiled the answers here a little bit, but the next activity that I want you to do, and this is why we had the reading from that previous class, is I want you to do a kind of before and after graphic organizer here with the Enlightenment. Now I will go ahead and, I'll see if I can erase these things, but if I can't, no big deal. The idea behind this, again, is that we are looking, just as an example here, there we go. Now the answers are cleared off. Is that like a before and after. So again, this is something that you can do on your own, but you should be able to do this within about 4 or 5 minutes. If you have to go back and look at notes, that's okay, but that's probably a sign that you missed something and you need to go back and do some more careful reading. Okay? Awesome. So let's get to the American Revolution. So our objectives here are pretty straightforward. We are looking for the context of why it occurred, and then some kind of big picture thinking about different causes and some of the major different kind of events. Okay? So a couple of essential questions to write down. Again, you can pause the video and take time to write these down. But again, this is kind of what we're looking at. So kind of, again, the big picture, the context, and then some of the different causes and events that might appear on a test. So let's talk first about the French and Indian War. So again, since this is a survey course and you're not going to be expected to know absolutely everything that's ever occurred in world history up until this point, one event that you need to be at least conversationally familiar with is something called the French and Indian War. Now, the French and Indian War happens before the American Revolution, and the entire reason why we bring it up and why it is necessary to know for this time period with the American Revolution is the effects that this war is going to have beforehand. Now, overseas, it's called the 7 Years' War. It also ties into the succession for the Habsburg throne. It's a very complicated war in and of itself, but we're going to keep things really simple here, okay? And the French and Indian War, despite its namesake, is not the French versus the Native Americans. It's the French and Native Americans versus Britain and its colonists, okay? Now, the French and Indian War has a few kind of key profound effects that you need to know. One is that after the French and Indian War, which takes place in the 1750s and trails off into the 1760s, is that wars are crazy expensive. This is true especially in the modern day, but there's kind of this myth out there that getting involved in a war resurrects or can bring back your economy. Not really true. That's not exactly a direct through line. But wars are crazy expensive because of the armies that you have to field, all the supplies, when you shoot a cannonball, you don't get that value back, right? And so after this war, Britain is crazy in debt. And as you can see there, it costs £64 million a year just to fund colonial defense, for going on. And this lasts for 7 years, right? So you can do the math on this really quickly. And just to be able to pay the interest on the debt, Britain has to commit 60% of its budget every single year. They're not even paying down on the debt. They're just paying the bank to keep, the debt alive, for lack of a better word. So why is this all relevant and, significant for us? Well, it matters because, again, they're in debt and they're going to have some way of negotiating and getting their way out of that. Come back to that idea here in a second. The second big effect out of this is that Britain is going to issue the Proclamation of 1763. And specifically, this is King George who will do this. And there's two different takes on what this proclamation was really for. bottom line is, west of the Appalachian Mountains, the king kind of sets this line that says, colonists, please do not settle past here. Now, of course, because they're Americans, they go ahead and they do that. But the whole idea, according to two different varied theories of the Proclamation of 1763, is that either on the one hand, the king sets this line so that colonists stop getting in fights with Native Americans, because again, wars are expensive. The second, a little bit more cynical interpretation of it, is that the king does not want the colonists to move west of this line because it is harder to collect taxes from them. Either way, both are, there's probably a little bit of element of truth to both of them. It's going to really, really tick the colonists off, because one of the ways of getting ahead at this time in terms of socioeconomically for a lot of the colonists is to buy land. And once British armies are in place, that's really going to, again, and this proclamation is in place, that's really going to put the brakes on that happening. There's also, in the last big effect out of these, out of the French and Indian Wars, there's this kind of new sense of like colonial identity that's going to emerge. Is, when Britain is sending all these colonists over, again, and by this point there are many, 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 many white folk over in the quote-unquote New World. There's this idea that, yes, we're still British, but are we something different or new? And that's really going to be something that is going to be percolating around the colonies through lots of different things, newspapers, people sitting down and talking with one another. The idea that somehow the colonists were somehow different than the folks back home. So let's talk about what is then going to be the big change. So this guy right here, King George III, is really going to, because of all those things, is going to shift the dynamic of the relationship that Britain has with its colonies in the Americas. And George I and George II, so that was his dad and his grandfather, they really had an approach to the colonies that historians have termed salutary neglect. So that's just a way of saying politely leaving them alone. They really let the colonies run themselves. And this was done through colonial assemblies and different royal governors and a whole bunch of other things, colonial legislatures. And for a long time, as you can see there, about 45 years, this works pretty well in terms of just like letting the colonies, police themselves, run themselves, implement their own taxes, etc., etc. That is all going to come to an end. And again, the reason is because, again, if you're going to need to start to collect money from these folks, you just can't simply leave them alone, right? There's going to have to be some kind of involvement that is going to have to happen on a greater kind of regulatory scale. So again, the colonies have been running themselves under salutary neglect, and this is really then when things are going to shift, okay? So if you're not familiar with how the British monarchy works at this point, this started with George I, but by the time we get to George III, the king is actually not the one running laws or writing laws anymore. The king will have a profound influence on where the country is going, especially foreign policy and different laws and things like that. But he's not going to be sitting in Parliament writing them. The people who are going to be doing that now are going to be prime ministers, and that is exactly the setup that happens today. With how the British parliamentary democracy system works. That guy right there, that is George Grenville, okay? And he is going to be the one who's going to start to do all of these actions on behalf of King George to start to bring salutary neglect to an end. So how does he do it? So the first act that gets passed, this is where all the acts start to come in, is the Sugar Act. Okay, the Sugar Act was technically already on the books. So it's not really anything, surprising, necessarily, but the idea that we're going to be making sure that for every gallon of molasses that is coming out of the West Indies, because again, those are big, sugar and molasses producing areas, there's going to be a 3-penny tax per gallon. Of course, American colonists, because they're already very good at this, they're going to be smuggling and bribing their way around it, because again, it's all about money, right? But again, you kind of already see here just a hint of what is going to come. The next thing that is then really going to now ratchet up and change the dynamic is going to be the second act that Grenville puts in place, and this is going to be the Stamp Act. Now, a very common misconception with a lot of folks when they look at the Stamp Act and when it is passed is they think that is a tax on stamps. It is not. The stamp is the tax, and it is put on pretty much everything that involves paper, which is kind of the easy way to remember it. Now, if you're like, well, why would you tax paper? That sounds really stupid and basic. Remember, at this time, like, paper is the medium of the economy, right? It is how, like, people exchange everything from, like, business ledgers to land titles to, newspapers, playing cards. And you're like, playing cards are going to get taxed? Yes. Anything that is a paper product has the potential here to get taxed. And this, because again, like, this would be the equivalent of like taxing Wi-Fi today, right? This is going to meet just a huge amount of resistance in comparison to something like the Sugar Act before. There's a Stamp Act Congress that gets called together by the colonies, which is a good early example of the colonies like coming together to have like a voice. It's also going to meet a whole bunch of very informal resistance. So this is where like groups of young men who will eventually become known as the Sons of Liberty will begin to organize. They'll go after tax collectors that are appointed by the crown. They will attempt to boycott certain British products that are coming along, especially ones that are going to have the stamp attached to it. And a lot of those tax collectors, again, just talking more here about the informal kind of resistance that bubbles up from is that a lot of them are going to be very hostilely treated. Some of them get tarred and feathered. I've attached a video here. I'm gonna let you play it on your own so that I don't have to get in trouble with YouTube. But that is something that they will go after tax collectors with in terms of like a form of social shame / death, because dying by tarring and feathering is a very painful process. Okay, moving on. So I give you kind of an example of a parallel here of what the Stamp Act would be like. That would be like taxing Wi-Fi or the internet today. It would not go well, right? So then this is where, let's just take a moment to back up to like an 80,000 foot view. Why are the colonists so pissed? What's going on here? And so I have an easy acronym for you, PEEP. You can come up with your own, but these are just things that I kind of like always go back and hang my hat on so that I can remember why are the colonists so upset and so mad, regarding all of these changes that are going to be happening. So one big thing that I will point you to are the spreading ideas of the Enlightenment. So again, another class, we looked at some of the things that are getting passed on around in the Enlightenment, like John Locke's ideas about that the power that really resides in government is that is what comes from popular sovereignty. Power comes from the people. We have other Enlightenment thinkers who are really starting to question the power that an absolute monarch should have, and all of this kind of gets wrapped up in this philosophical milieu of all these imperial reforms are endangering this L word, liberty. Okay, that's one perspective. The other is just a simple, sheer economic standpoint. For artisans and merchants, especially those in the northern colonies, where a lot of the economic engine of the colonies is centered, these regulations are super painful. Okay, and it's not that, as I note here, it's not that Americans hated taxes. Necessarily. They were okay with ones that were internally levied or like internally developed by their own colonial assemblies. They were fine with that. It's annoying, right? But like we understand when a tax needs to be done because it'll pay for like our local school system or something like that, right? That makes sense to us in the modern day. The reason why Americans hate it is because they have no input on a lot of these big acts like the Stamp Act, for example. And this is where the whole like no taxation with representation saying comes from. Now, there's a couple other things to keep in mind here, and I've also put this here as well, is that just under the word excitement, is that there is also kind of a very social element to these protests as well, like especially for younger men who are under the influence of alcohol in large groups. They do dumb things. And they will go and they will tar, and feather tax collectors because it's fun. Because again, like that's just, something you do in your loving free time, right? As a young American. These protests are, again, there is very much a bottom up element to them as well as a top down element. Political wise, I also mentioned here that there's this kind of, again, this ties a lot into the philosophical thing mentioned before, is that this idea of like a bureaucracy kind of lording over the Americans is something that the colonists rather, they're not calling themselves Americans yet, is that they are concerned about. Okay. All right. So, what happens then with all this protest? Okay. So Britain does respond, and what they do is they repeal the Stamp Act. So it just gets scratched off the books. And then they immediately turn around and publish something called the Declaratory Act. Now, the Declaratory Act literally is just what it sounds like. They declare, despite scratching off the Stamp Act, that Parliament and the King have absolute authority over the colonies. So this is essentially saying, like, we absolutely hear you, but screw you. It's kind of like the very delicate, nice political way of saying this. Okay, and what will they do? Parliament will replace the Stamp Act with the Townshend Act. So, Townshend, where that name comes from, is Charles Townshend was at that time the current British Chancellor of the Exchequer. That's like Britain's treasury. It gets named after him. So what does it tax? Paper, lead, glass, and tea. And if you're like, well, that doesn't sound as bad, well, just remember, like, Stamp Act basically taxed everything on paper. So now you're taking that existing Stamp Act that was there, it got wiped out again, and now you're expanding it to lead, which is a very commonly used metal at this time, and everything from, like, cutlery to, like, what you would use, like, in a blacksmith shop or something like that, glass, and then also Americans' favorite beverage of choice, which was tea. Okay, the average American at this point is drinking just a ridiculous amount of tea. It is on a similar scale to like coffee today is what I would tell you in terms of, like, thinking about it in a comparative scale. Now, how do Americans respond? Even more organized than before. We have groups like the Daughters of Liberty who are getting organized at this point. You can see this advertisement over here for the Sons of Liberty meeting, where they're going to be meeting under the Liberty Tree. Their colonists are trying to make their own tea, like their own self-made goods. It's really bad. They're trying to, like, homespin their own cloth so they don't have to rely on that coming from Britain. It's not very good, but hey, they're trying. And so again, you can start to see that, the resistance is getting a little bit more organized, right? So how does Britain respond to all this? And this one, for a lot of people, is a little bit of surprise. You might think, like, oh, like, Britain's going to crack down even harder. And this is where actually Britain does back off quite significantly after the protests on the Townshend Act. And actually Parliament does go and they repeal most of the Townshend Act, okay? Except, significantly, the tax on tea, okay? Now, Americans appreciate this, colonists appreciate this, but it's not like, again, like, everything just goes and pipes all the way down to a base kind of like tension level. There's still a lot of events that are going on during this kind of 3 to 5 year period. The Boston Massacre happens in 1770. If you're not familiar with the Boston Massacre, it is not at all what Revere's engraving here shows. It's not just, British soldiers mowing down, innocent civilians. The short story of what happens here is that there was a bunch of civilians that grabbed basically, like, hard chunks of ice, bricks, stones, things that would, like, legitimately hurt people, and tried to assault a British kind of, we're basically harassing, like, a group of British soldiers. And the soldiers, pretty rightfully, defended themselves against, like, getting, hurt and or killed. And when that happens, just, again, the short story of what happens here is that John Adams, who will go on and become the second president of the United States, John Adams, a Boston sourced lawyer, will actually defend them in court, and they're found to be not guilty of murdering these civilians. However, it's going to still inflame tensions, right? But again, stuff like that's still going to be happening in the undercurrent as all of these events are going on. As things churn, okay, and are continuing to kind of bubble there below the surface, Parliament is going to pass something called the Tea Act. Okay, now you're like, well, wait, I thought there still was a tax on tea. Yes. So here's what the Tea Act does, okay? And again, this is a little bit complicated, so just stick with me as I explain it. Okay, the Tea Act takes the price of tea that was being smuggled in. Well, okay, let's even back up even further. So again, recall, the British East India Company is it's a mercantilism, right? It's a company that is being mostly run by the British Crown. They are the ones responsible for bringing tea into the colonies. And again, the colonies are only supposed to be using them as, like, their main source of tea. they take the Tea Act takes that price that was there and lowers it even further than what the British East India Company was selling it at. And in fact, it takes it so low that it takes it below the prices of the tea that colonists were smuggling in from other countries, particularly the Dutch. Okay, and you're like, well, that sounds good. Why would colonists be angry about that? Well, they're angry about it because it does another thing too. So again, like what would typically happen in this case is a ship would come into a place like Boston Harbor. Okay, it's then going to unload its tea, and again, this is like what would usually occur. It would unload its tea into basically like the equivalent of a Costco. Okay, like again, merchants would run all of this business, and then they would take that, these huge wholesale crates of tea, and then they would distribute it out to the local, shops and taverns and other places where Americans would get their drinks. The Tea Act completely cuts the middle large wholesale distributors of tea out of the tea distribution process. So not only are the colonists angry because they are all of their kind of supply chains of getting their cheaper tea at that moment, at that place, place and time have been disrupted. They're all of those merchants whose business relied upon the importation of relatively at that time cheaper Dutch tea. They are just completely cut out of making money. Now you're like, well, why should we care about these merchants so much? Merchants control, like just as an example, like Boston and Philadelphia, they control in some cases upwards of 80% of all of the commerce that is going in and out of these harbors. So these are extremely influential people, and they can really rally groups of, folks, their workers, to express their voice and their discontent with this. Okay, again, this is extremely disruptive. So these merchants are going to really make their voices heard, and the one way they do that is going to be through the Boston Tea Party. There's a video here I'd like you to click and watch. You can check that out. Okay, so again, just continue on with my video once you've done so. And then this is going to almost bring us to the end of this lesson, which is what happens after the Boston Tea Party. So after the Boston Tea Party, Britain has just had enough. They are done with dealing with these annoying colonists who are constantly griping about having to pay their fair share of, making up for the French and Indian War, and they're just done with it. Okay, this is the equivalent of like, mom and dad saying they're going to turn the car around and go home. Okay, they're just done. So what do they pass? They're called the coercive acts. If you coerce somebody into something, it means you're making them do it. Okay, the colonists are going to call this the intolerable acts because they simply can't tolerate them. Now, what exactly are they? It's kind of like an umbrella. It does a bunch of different things. Okay, so the coercive acts, first thing, because the Boston Tea Party happens in Boston Harbor, they just shut down Boston Harbor, just entirely. It is blockaded. It is shut down. And again, ports at this time are like the absolute heart of a lot of these cities, and shutting that down is an extremely drastic step. Again, it would be like just like shutting off all the internet for Indiana because Indiana decided to like just, be mean to Illinois and Ohio, right? Like it would just be an extremely drastic step that is taken. It's also going to make its royal governors more powerful so that they can have more authority over their own colonists. If you don't know, royal governors were appointed by the crown. So there you go. Massachusetts, the Massachusetts colony charter is going to be completely just gotten rid of. And the crown is going to take direct control over it so that, so that they have more influence over what's going on in Boston. They're also going to ban town meetings from happening in Boston because, again, like it's groups of these merchants who are getting folks together and getting them angry and, upset and getting them off to do things. And then there's other things in the coercive acts that are done as a part of this. So one is the Quartering Act. And this one for a lot of folks is sort of confusing as to why this would be so intrusive. But what it does, the Quartering Act, is it basically tells the colonists, hey, you are going to be housing and feeding British soldiers in your own homes while they are there occupying and staying in Boston. Now, Why is this such a big deal? Well, as you can imagine, this is a huge invasion of what Americans colonists consider to be their privacy, right? But it's also like a form of like diet surveillance. It's very hard for people to actually, go and say like, hey, let's go meet with our neighbors, and so we can organize. Like, you can't do that, right? And this will make the colonists so upset that explicitly in the Bill of Rights, this is prevented from the American government doing this to its own civilians. Even today, that cannot be done. There's also something in there called the Justice Act that means that basically that if you're a colonist and you would commit certain crimes, you wouldn't be tried by a jury of your peers in the colonies. You would actually be shipped back to Britain to be tried. Again, just makes the colonists even more mad. And then there's something that a last part of these coercive acts that is a little surprising for a lot of students when they first hear about it, but it is very real, and that is something called the Quebec Act. So the Quebec Act is this act that on its face seems completely like it would be non-controversial. It allows Catholics to freely worship in Canada. You're like, well, why would that be a problem? So at this point, okay, because again, Britain won the French and Indian Wars. They own Canada, and part of Canada, there are a lot of French Catholics there. Now, again, most British colonists are fiercely Protestant, okay, and that will continue for hundreds of years after the American, actual like U.S. government is set up. The United States won't have its first Catholic, will not have its first Catholic president until JFK. Okay, now why was this such a big deal? Yes, because again, the British colonists are fiercely Protestant. They don't get along with Catholics. But what really actually scared Protestant Americans was this idea that by the Quebec Act being passed, like you're allowing Catholics to worship in Canada, this was again a real thing, is that Americans believed that this was actually a very subtle way of telling the Pope, again, the head of the Catholic Church, that he was going to come over and take over the colonies. And you're like, what? The Pope would come over and take over the colonies, or like would take over part of Canada? Yes, Americans really thought the Pope was going to come invade and would take over things, and it was called the Popish Plot. Americans, we like our conspiracy theories, and this was something that legitimately Americans were scared of because of this act happening. So again, it sounds very, very strange to us in modern day terms, but that was something that back then in contemporary times people were legitimately fearful of. Okay, so to close out the lesson, okay, how again things are going to kind of settle at this point is that we're simply just waiting for somebody to toss a match on this just pile of gasoline and to get things to go. So to close things out, I have a little clip here from Hamilton that you can watch that kind of gives a good summary of where things are at this point. You should check it out. Okay, click the link, watch it, and then that will bring you to then your exit ticket for this lesson. Okay, and you can read it right here. You need to complete it on Pear Deck. Okay, so that is it for this lesson. At this point, I'm going to now go ahead and record the subsequent follow-up, which is like, how does the revolution end? Where do things go from there? And I will see you on that video. All right, bye.